Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the webinar hosted by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center, also known as the CASC, which is based at the University of Colorado Boulder. I'm Imtiaz Rangwala, Climate Science Lead at the CASC. I'm co-hosting this webinar with Christy Miller-Hissed, who is a postdoc at CASC. We bring you these webinars to facilitate a discussion of science, research, and best practices related to adaptation and resource management under a rapidly changing climate, with the focus on the North Central US that encompasses the Missouri and the Upper Colorado River basins. So before I introduce our speaker for today, a quick word on housekeeping. We are recording this webinar, and you can find all our webinar recordings on our website, which is ncasc.colorado.edu. During the webinar, all participants will be muted, but you will have the ability to unmute during the Q&A period at the end. We, however, greatly encourage you to submit your questions and comments through the chat box anytime during the webinar. And now I'm extremely delighted to introduce Justin Gude, our speaker for today. Justin has been the Wildlife Research and Technical Services, or RTS, Bureau Chief for Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks since 2008. The RTS Bureau consists of wildlife research, health, biometrics, and survey programs, and their work covers a variety of taxa ranging in size in all corners of the state, from songbirds and bats to moose. Justin is responsible for overseeing the work of the RTS Bureau, as well as ensuring integration of wildlife research and management programs at Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So he's often involved in facilitating working groups, such as the one that will be described in his presentation today. Justin has a master's in fish and wildlife management from Montana State University. He also completed the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Decision Analysis certification program and has been involved in many structured decision-making processes. He also serves on the CASC and USDA Northern Plains Regional Climate Hub Joint Stakeholder Committee. On a personal note, I've greatly enjoyed my little collaboration with Justin and his partners on the mountain goat project that Justin will talk about today. So Justin, thank you very much again for doing this, and please take it away.
Great, thank you, Imtiaz. Let me see if I can get my...
We cannot hear you, Justin.
Can you hear me now?
Sorry. Yeah. I can hear you. Sorry about that.
You can? Okay. Okay, so just a quick outline about what I'm going to cover in this presentation today. I'm going to explain a process that we went through and the results of that process about to provide guidance to mountain goat management in Montana. Clarify the outcomes that we came up with in the process and the direction. I'll discuss briefly some more recent developments, and we should have plenty of time for discussion and questions about what we did. So Imtiaz asked me to spend a little time talking about the process that we used. So the first thing I'll say is that it was a working group process. There were a lot of people involved. We conducted the process over a year and a half with many multi-day meetings and video conferences and a lot of work in between. So the working group that we assembled included wildlife biologists, staff from each of our administrative regions that manage mountain goat populations, as well as our statewide game management bureau chief, staff from Forest Service that manages a lot of mountain goat habitat, the Glacier National Park, which has a substantial mountain goat population. And we also invited staff from the wildlife program, from the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And they accepted and were kept up to speed, but due to their, they have a lot of responsibilities and not many staff, and they actually couldn't make any of the meetings. And it was intended to be sort of a networking approach where each staff member was working with their co-workers to inform the entire process. We also had a science team that consisted of a couple of our research scientists, a professor from MSU that worked on mountain goats quite a bit, and then we had Imtiaz from the NC CASC as our, what we like to call him, our embedded climate scientist in this process. And then there was a facilitation team, which was my role in the process. And I'll also say that during the process, we also brought in science and management staff from Idaho, Alberta, Alaska, and Bruce Smith, who at the time he was retired. He spent his career as a manager in the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he's a long interest in mountain goats. So it was a big effort to pull all of this together. So the process we used is called structured decision making, which is the recent moniker for a larger field of decision analysis and decision science. And the way I would describe it is that it's not rocket science. There's a couple of quotes here from Ralph Keeney, who is one of the leaders in this field. The field was developed largely in the business world, but there's been applications in natural resource management and government and every field you can imagine. It's really just common sense. It's a way of thinking. They're not, there's not an explicit formula or axioms or procedures. It's just really a way to clarify thinking. And you'll get a sense of that through this talk today. So the key elements of structured decision making, first of all, it's values focused. So the first thing that we do in the process is clarify our objectives, our values, like what we want to accomplish and why. And that is in contrast to human nature, intuitive decision making, in which we usually jump straight to what are our alternatives. So we start a little bit further back in the decision-making process than that. And then the other key element of structured decision-making is that it's a way to break down the problem, the entire decision, into its component parts and provide clear thinking about each component, complete analyses that are relevant, and then put everything back together to get a better sense of the decision that has to be made. So there's a way to think about structured decision-making that on two axes representing objectives and facts. So objectives can go from clear to disputed, especially in public situations or situations where there's multiple decision makers or multiple people are affected or involved. And then facts can go from well understood to uncertain to disputed. So there's kind of a sweet spot in here where objectives are relatively clear and facts are either well understood or uncertain, not quite disputed, that structured decision-making is appropriate. And adaptive management falls in there too. It's a flavor of structured decision-making where there's quite a bit of uncertainty and decisions are repeated in space and time. So there's an opportunity to learn and get better at making decisions while you're reducing uncertainty. And there's quite a bit of overlap between structured decision-making and conflict approaches, conflict management, transformation type approaches, or joint fact-finding. So there's not a clear distinction. There's a gray area there where in some of those cases, structured decision-making can be useful, which we have found. So over the last decade or so, our agency has used structured decision-making a lot on a lot of high-profile issues. And I've listed some here where we've convened groups, either public working groups or agency working groups, to fully go through a structured decision-making process to make progress on some thorny issues. I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are, have been big issues for our agency. But I want to talk a little bit more about this because this is another figure from Ralph Keeney, just making the point that a full application of decision analysis or structured decision making is not always needed. So in this case, Ralph Keeney has exemplified this by saying, if you're going to make 10,000 decisions, a couple of thousand of those might be super easy. You don't have to think much at all. And maybe 7,000 are, the consequences are small enough that it's not worth thinking about more. So maybe 1 in 10 of those decisions are worth thinking about a little bit more, and you're going to give some more thought to. And out of those 1,000, maybe 50, you need to complete a full decision analysis on, which is what we did in this mountain goat process. And in the other cases, if you're just using thought consistent with decision analysis or getting some clear thinking about some components of making a decision, that's all you really need to do. And we've used structured decision-making in this manner in our agency quite a bit. And the most recent example, which I spent a lot of time on the last couple of weeks, is with our elk plan. We're about to initiate, or we have initiated a new process for an elk management plan in the state, for which we convened a public working group to clarify what the problem is and what our objectives are. So just a couple of elements of making the decision. And that is currently out for, it was adopted by our commission last week and is out for public comment now as the fundamental elements that are going to guide our next elk management plan. So we aren't always using everything in all elements of structured decision making. That's a point I wanted to make. So all of the elements of structured decision making are captured in this figure. So the first step would be identifying the problem, clarifying the objectives. Here, there's a lot that can guide us. Then we clarify our alternatives. What are our choices? Then we get into more of the science aspect, like what do we think the consequences of choosing an alternative would be? Here's where we use the data we have, the modeling we have. And then we get into, okay, so what are the trade-offs? What would the optimal choice be, given that usually we have multiple objectives to accomplish and we can't equally accomplish all of them, that sort of thing. So we have to consider preferences, weights, risk attitudes, that sort of thing. And then making a decision is the last step after you've clearly thought about each element. And the arrows here go both ways, back and forth. And it actually is more complicated than that, because sometimes even when you're, for example, working on the consequences, predicting consequences, you realize you didn't fully describe the whole problem. So you need to go back to that step. So it isn't quite as linear as this. There's a lot of iteration. So that's all I'm going to say about the process that we used. And I'm going to switch now to get into mountain goats, and I'm going to organize the rest of the talk according to this diagram here. I'm going to talk about each element that we went through. So this is my only background slide about mountain goats in Montana. We've divided mountain goats into 58 population units. So populations are not as easy as you might think to define for mountain goats and for other species, in terms of we don't know where they start and stop. So population units is a term that we use it's like political boundaries or landscape features, ways that we can identify discrete populations for our purposes here. So there's two different colors on this figure. The orange herds in the northwest part of the state, those are all native mountain goat herds that have been here for millennia. The yellow areas in the eastern part of this figure in what is central Montana, those are all introduced areas, in the sense that mountain goats have not always been there. There's no fossil evidence, that sort of thing. But in the 1940s and 50s, our agency established those herds largely by taking mountain goats out of the native herds and putting them in those areas. So the orange herds, the native herds, those are the areas, a lot of those herds are struggling right now. Very small herds, a lot smaller than they used to be. And the yellow areas, the introduced populations, on the whole, are doing a lot better. Some of those herds are thriving, and a lot of them are stable. And the other polygons on this map, the sort of gray outlines, represent the distribution of bighorn sheep, which they use habitat very similar. There's a lot of overlap in their niches, their ecological niches. And they share pathogens, which is going to be a big part of this. And pathogens, what I mean there are largely bacteria that are associated with pneumonia-associated, which cause large declines in bighorn sheep populations, or can cause large declines in bighorn sheep populations. And recently we have learned that mountain goats carry these pathogens and could be affected too. So now we're into the problem, definition of what the problem is that we needed to address. And we divided that into sort of 3 elements. First element being responsibility, in that the mission of our agency, in the state of Montana, according to its laws, established our agency to steward the wildlife that contribute to the quality of life for present and future generations. So of course, mountain goats fall underneath that. They are ecologically important and quite iconic. It's rare to find people that don't love mountain goats. People just like them. They represent alpine areas, basically. They've declined across a lot of their range. We've got concerns for their present and future status, as well as concerns about opportunities for people to enjoy mountain goats, either through consumptive, which means hunting, and non-consumptive, which means just being able to see mountain goats when you're backpacking or whatever. People love mountain goats. So one thing I'll point out here is that when we, probably the most contentious part of our process was deciding whether or not we would place more value on the native herds than the introduced herds. And our explicit decision was that we are not going to differentiate between those herds, that mountain goats are valued everywhere. And there's several reasons for that. One of which is that our public doesn't distinguish. The public, for example, in the introduced herds areas, we don't hear that the people who enjoy those herds don't enjoy them quite as much. They like them just as much as people who live in areas with native herds. The second point is that those introduced mountain goats are from the same genetic stock. I mean, we literally took mountain goats from part of Montana and moved them to another part. So in that sense, they're still native to our state. Another important point was that because most of the native herds are struggling, if we're going to use translocations, which we're going to talk about, so capturing goats in one area and moving them to another, we're going to have to depend on those introduced herds for that in large part. And then finally, IMTIAZ had a big impact in this last reason, is that we don't want to think about the past as necessarily the way it's going to be in the future. So in other words, the best mountain goat habitat may not, in the future, may not be where it was in the past. And we just need to maybe think about where they can persist into the future. The second part of our problem was uncertainty. We don't, the best way to describe our population monitoring is intermittent and difficult. So we have limited information on abundance. We have almost no information on vital rates, which is like survival, reproductive rates, or even population boundaries. We don't really know what impact predation or other ecological processes have. Of course, where they live in large part are alpine areas, and with climate change, that they could be affected by climate change. And like I mentioned, they have shared respiratory pathogens with bighorn sheep. So we don't know a lot, and what we do know just causes concern. So that uncertainty worries people. We also face substantial challenges. We don't have dedicated funding for mountain goats like we do for some other species. Like, for example, bighorn sheep, we have a lot more funding just because of our state statutes that is dedicated to bighorn sheep than we do for mountain goats. So that means to work on mountain goats, we're competing for other agency resources that have to be spent on other issues as well. So there's competition there, and we are constantly bombarded with different segments of the public advocating for their issue. They want us to focus on it. And mountain goats, in a bigger picture sense, have limited advocacy. So it's hard to get resources dedicated to mountain goats. And sometimes it's just hard to work on mountain goats, like the goat in this picture. Capturing mountain goats or doing anything with them is just not possible in some areas. And we don't have a management plan to guide us. So the decision that needed to be made, that the working group defined, was that by the end of 2019, which is a goal that we met in large part, the reporting we didn't quite meet the goal, but the working group and the working with our partners in sort of the network approach that I described, we wanted to recommend to our division administrator in the state and the director of the agency a suite of management strategies, identifying information gaps and priorities for monitoring and research needs that are going to help us achieve mountain goat conservation. So this is what we set out to do. Okay, so we're moving to objectives now, and we defined a couple of different types of objectives. So we had what we called overarching objectives, which was composed of both strategic and local objectives. So these are objectives that we didn't consider any alternatives that weren't going to achieve these. So strategic objectives are sort of higher level objectives that we needed our GOAT program to contribute to. So these were cooperative working relationships, providing opportunity for public enjoyment, and generating public support for goats. Everything we considered was going to address these. And then we had some objectives in this overarching objective category, which they didn't apply everywhere. Like, for example, mitigating impacts of human development or recreation on mountain goat distribution, combating habituation, and managing conifer encroachment. Those first two are not really issues in most mountain goat populations that we have in the state. We don't have a lot of human development or a lot of recreation in the range of most mountain goat herds. Habituation is a big issue in a few areas, but not most areas. And conifer encroachment, managing conifer encroachment is not possible in most mountain goat range in our state because we're talking about remote areas that are formally designated as wilderness where that's just not going to happen. So we only considered alternatives that had us addressing these things where they are relevant. Everybody agreed they just need to be addressed where they are relevant, but not everywhere.
Justin, could you explain habituation?
Sure, thank you, Imtiaz. Habituation is a situation like is represented in this picture, which is from the Bridger Mountain Range near Bozeman, where animals are just used to being around people and they come in close contact with people and it creates an issue, sometimes a safety issue for people in a bad situation for mountain goats in that it can lead to removal, that sort of thing. So mountain goats coming into camps, licking anywhere people have peed, that sort of thing, just too close of contact between people and the animals. Okay, so the other kind of objectives that we identified are fundamental objectives. And these are the objectives that drove our decision-making process in the sense that the alternatives that we considered could achieve these things to varying degrees. So we wanted to maximize the number of occupied mountain goat population units, so the distribution of mountain goats. Maximize the number of mountain goat populations that are meeting their trend objectives. So either we want more stable or fewer mountain goats, which considers, those objectives consider the limitations in each unit, limitations in habitat or tolerance, that sort of thing. We want to minimize disease risks to bighorn sheep, minimize disease risks to mountain goats. We need to minimize costs and minimize social conflict resulting from mountain goat management, which could come in various forms, which we'll talk a little bit about and you'll get a sense of. Okay, so the alternatives we considered, we developed a set of management strategies, which are sort of groups of actions that are similar to each other. We defined here, I'm going to talk a little bit about each one. So the status quo is what we do now, which mostly consists of very conservative harvest management, so very limited hunting opportunity. Our survey program that we have, a description of what we're doing now. The top-down mortality management strategy was sort of taking that approach to the next level and also including increased harvest opportunity for carnivores in some herds that are really struggling. So herds that are declining or very small that we want to increase, but just have not been increasing. An introduction strategy involves translocations from some herds, some in Montana and some sourced from out of Montana, into new areas that are not currently occupied by mountain goats. Augmentation strategy was focused on the same thing, using translocations, so taking animals from herds that are doing well and putting them into places that already have mountain goats, but the herds are struggling, to augment those herds. The habitat protection strategy was to protect certain habitats that are important seasonally to mountain goats, such as winter range, calving range, that sort of thing. Protect them from human use. So get people out of there, essentially, was the approach there. So these first 5 strategies were mutually exclusive. And we completed a full decision analysis and looked at the results. And we used that to develop the last 2 alternatives, which are combinations of all of these things in specific areas, either with or without the augmentations. And you'll get a sense for why we did that both ways, because the augmentations especially may or may not help depending on your point of view. So the one thing I'll say about these, I'm not going to go into great detail about exactly what we considered, but each one of these was specified to a pretty high level of detail, which we needed to do in order to make predictions about what would happen. So we specified where exactly we would do each one of these things and to what degree. And that was not intended to represent the only options for doing those. So this whole process was more like a proof of concept for how this might work, rather than an actual prescription for what we were going to do where. Okay, so the next step was predicting the consequences. And this was complicated because there's so much uncertainty about mountain goats. So we had to incorporate that uncertainty for predictions related to a few objectives. So the amount of mountain goat habitat that would be occupied, we needed to incorporate the effect of climate change on mountain goat habitat. So we incorporated that uncertainty, which I'm going to talk through in the next series of slides, all of how we incorporated all these different uncertainties. For mountain goat population trend, we have a lot of uncertainty in population sizes, vital rates, and age structure, which we incorporated. And for disease risks, we don't know in most cases what diseases are present in mountain goat populations, nor what is going to happen if we mix pathogens. So if we do some translocations and move pathogens around, which we'll talk a little bit more about. We were able to predict costs of the different management strategies, our alternatives, without uncertainty. We used, basically we have agency budgeting functions. We could go into databases and see how much we spend on these things. And for social conflict, we predicted without uncertainty, primarily because we don't and probably are never going to have quantitative measures of social conflict. So we developed a 1 to 5 scale, like how much conflict would this alternative create, based on considering explicit kinds of conflict, such as harvesting more carnivores or liberalizing carnivore regulations. There's a lot of people that do not like that. We could create social conflict also by closing areas to humans. People do not like, especially on public lands, places that they are not allowed to go into, that sort of thing. So we identified specific kinds of conflict, asked the working group to forecast how much conflict each alternative would create. And there really was not disagreement about it. It's pretty clear what conflict would be created by each alternative. Okay, so to incorporate climate change uncertainty in forecasting occupied mountain goat habitat under each one of our alternatives, MTI has really helped us a lot with this one. So we wanted to look 50 years out into the future to have a long time horizon, which climate change is going to happen over a long time horizon, but also not too long that we have no idea what the world's going to look like. So it was kind of a compromise. And so what was available to us are the mid-century projections from the global climate models, which covered 50 years out. a 30-year time span here means that are sort of standard output from the GCMs, the global climate models. And we chose 3 different ones that represent a spectrum of precipitation and temperature. So we wanted them to be very different from each other, and that's why we chose them. So we chose these 3 models, but these 3 models are also in the top tier, the top 10% of accuracy based on being able to forecast what has happened to the climate in the Pacific Northwest. So we chose these 3 models. The names of the labs that created them are not as important as knowing that they cover a range of future scenarios. We also don't know that climate change is going to limit mountain goat habitat. So what we did was we developed resource selection function models based on the current distribution of mountain goats. We developed 2 models. One model that did not have any climate-related variables. So that model is represented in the top right. The other model included variables that are as predictors of mountain goat distribution, that those variables are affected by climate. So we fit both of these models, made the top 2 panel maps, and then using the standard output from the global climate models, the mid-century projections, from those 3 models, we made projections for 3 possible future scenarios, mid-century scenarios, accounting for climate change. So to incorporate the uncertainty in climate change, we used the bottom 3 panels, so the 3 outputs from incorporating the GCM projections, and the top right, saying that, well, there's a chance that climate change is not going to affect mountain goat habitat in the future. And we made predictions for the area that's going to be occupied by mountain goats under each of our alternatives. And the primary conclusion from that part of our analysis was that under every model we considered, including the model of no climate change and the 3 projections that represent a range of temperature precipitation, if we establish new population introductions, we think we're going to have more area occupied, or if we pursue new population introductions, we're going to have more area occupied by mountain goats at mid-century. So there was not uncertainty there in this outcome. That was consistent among, no matter which model that we used, which map we used to represent future habitat. So while there is uncertainty in climate change, what the future is going to look like, and whether or not that's going to affect mountain goat distribution, new population introductions are a pretty resilient strategy. If we want more area occupied, we should be okay if we establish new populations and are smart about where we do it. Okay, so in order to predict population trend, the way we incorporated uncertainty here was by developing a simulation model, a population simulation model. We don't know with a lot of certainty about most mountain goat herds, the size of most mountain goat herds from our monitoring, but every one of our biologists, every biologist in the state that's responsible, we worked with them to provide a range, a minimum or a maximum, what they think, and we used that range. There's been long-term studies of mountain goat survival, fecundity, that sort of thing in Alberta, just to the north of us, and in Southeast Alaska. And working with those people that ran those studies, we incorporated the vital rates that they've estimated to make projections, assuming that our vital rates are similar to those. And then the age structure, which is very important. So, what proportion of the herd is old versus young is very important for the dynamics, especially of small populations. So we estimated what the age structure would be using the vital rates. So sort of over time, the age structure will be sort of set if the vital rates have been the same for a long time. And we also needed to simulate the effects of harvest of mountain goats. So in our mountain goat licensing allows people to shoot both sexes in most cases and different ages. And we keep a database. Hunters are required to check in every mountain goat that they harvest. So we have a long-term database, and we were able to simulate the age structure of the harvest based on that. And we projected the effects of our management actions on mountain goat populations 1 generation into the future, which is 9 years for mountain goats. And the reason we went that far is because some of the management actions we might take will take a long time to materialize, but we can't go much farther than that because we don't know anything about mountain goats, and the level of uncertainty, even going one generation out, is very high. And that, the primary conclusion from this analysis, so what if we take different management options, what effect will we have on population trend, is that our uncertainty about mountain goat population dynamics is very influential. The impact of management actions that we might take on mountain goat survival, fecundity, is very important. Under some of the range of our uncertainty, some management actions would be more effective than others, and the range of uncertainty is very high. So, our choice of management actions is going to depend on what exactly the vital rates are in Montana, that sort of thing. So this is an influential uncertainty in that we can't specify which management action is optimal without knowing more about mountain goat population dynamics here. Okay, so disease risk uncertainty we captured in two ways. Like I said, we've got, so for our 58 mountain goat herd population units, we've tested for pneumonia-related pathogens in only 2 of those. Bighorn sheep, we've done a lot more testing, but still we only know a little bit. We like about less than half of the herds. So we came up with 3 hypotheses. Hypotheses to represent that uncertainty about which herds contain these or harbor these pathogens. 2 of them are just the ends of the spectrum. So only the herds we've tested and found them, that could be it, or it could be all of them. And then the 3rd hypothesis stems from the idea that these pathogens may have been introduced over a century or more of from the Spanish colonization, when domestic sheep were brought to the area. That could be the source. So we actually went back through the translocation records to see like which of these herds have overlapped with domestic sheep, bighorn sheep and mountain goats, or where the populations were established out of herds that had that overlap. And in the end, that third hypothesis was supposed to be a little bit more nuanced, but in the end, it really isn't any different than saying all herds have the pathogens, because we could only find one mountain goat or bighorn sheep herd that didn't have that historical tie to domestic sheep in the state. So the other type of uncertainty we accounted for is this mixing of microbial communities. So if we're going to translocate animals from one area to another, we're also going to move all the bacteria in those animals. And recently, in the scientific literature, it's clear that, so there might be different strains of the bacteria. There's certainly different genetic variants, and some of those may be more problematic than others. And it also may be that if you've got more than one species of bacteria, you're more likely to have a disease event than if you just have one. So there's this idea that mixing the communities is problematic as well, not just having the pathogens, but mixing the pathogens when we mix animals. And we don't know a lot about that in terms of what the actual risk is. And people have different tolerances for taking the risk. So we actually elicited from people how risky they thought that was. And so the conclusion from this analysis was that disease risk is always lower. We're going to have fewer herds at risk if we do not use translocations to establish new herds or to augment other herds. But if we are going to pursue translocations, knowing the pathogen communities at the source and recipient areas is going to help us reduce the number of herds at risk. So I want to talk a little bit about this figure to show you that idea of mixing pathogens, the microbial mixing coefficient, the risk multiplier that we came up with, also had a huge effect on our decision analysis. So on this figure, you've got all of our alternatives that we considered on the bottom, and the overall weight of support in our decision analysis for each alternative on the y-axis. So the bigger the bar, the more support. So we had this risk multiplier, which is a relative sense. So relative to knowing that pathogens are present, how risky is it to mix the pathogens during translocation? So these are the range of values that we elicited from our working group and our wildlife health program staff were from 0 to 3. So the three values tended to be the wildlife health staff saying that this is very risky. If you mix the pathogens among herds, it's 3 times as risky as just knowing that the pathogens are there. And the lower values of 0 represent, it's really a risk tolerance situation where people are saying, look, these herds are already struggling. So if we move in pathogens and they continue to struggle, that's one possible outcome, but it might also benefit them. So we're adding the possibility of an increase, which we don't have right now. So there's really no additional risk compared to what we've got already. And the group mean was 1.6. So if you just look here, so if we use the group mean or the group maximum risk multiplier, the introduction strategy is the most supported and the augmentation strategy is the least supported among all the alternatives we considered. However, if you use the lowest value of 0, saying we're not adding any risk, we flip that. The introduction strategy becomes the least supported and the augmentation strategy becomes the most supported. So this risk tolerance has a huge effect on the optimal choice of alternatives. Another way to characterize risk tolerance is just in the weights we put on these objectives, like how important are they, which we also elicited from our working group. And so we calculated a group mean from this elicitation exercise, but we also kept a few other sets of weights to represent the variation we saw here. So compared to the group mean, one set of weights we named the recovery focused weights, basically took importance away from these objectives related to minimizing disease risk. So reduce the importance of those and move that weight up to the objectives related to maximizing the distribution and increasing populations of mountain goats. So they said those are the most important things and disease is less important. We also had the flip. We had people that took weight away from the idea that we should increase the distribution or increase the size of goat populations. And they said the main thing we have to do is minimize these disease risks so we don't create more problems. So this is within our working group, assuming that the public also has this wide range of risk tolerance in weights that they would put on these objectives. And it also has a big effect. So this is the same figure working at the mean microbial mixing multiplier value. Just look at I just want to use this figure to explain the effects of these different weighting schemes. So for the group mean, the introduction strategy, so the strategy to establish new populations was the most supported. If we look at the recovery focused weighting scheme, that's also very supported, but so are alternatives with augmentations that might increase the size of some of these struggling populations. However, the risk averse weighting scheme results in low support for any strategy that involves translocations at all. So any effort to establish new populations or augment populations has very little support, and everything that doesn't have those is well supported. So it also has a big effect, the risk tolerance in this sense. So in the end, after we went through all this process and put everything back together, our recommendations, first of all, tying back in our overarching objectives, we want to accomplish our strategic objectives and work on our local objectives that are relevant only in some areas, like I mentioned earlier in the talk. We want to make sure that we keep that in the forefront and work on these things everywhere. But stemming from our decision analysis, the more formal part of the decision analysis, we can come up with some general recommendations based on our analysis results. First of all are some low-hanging fruit, and that is continuing to reduce the harvest in the small populations, so harvest by humans in small populations. That's a no-brainer, that's easy. We have been doing that as an agency over the last decade, especially. Where now at this point, like 90% of our hunting opportunity is in the introduced populations that are doing better. Also, protecting habitat, based on the modeling we did, it does not look like that's going to have a a huge effect. So protecting habitat from human use. So clearly, from other states and provinces, we know that it can. So in places where we know that it's an impact or going to be an impact and it's clear, we can advocate for protecting habitats in those areas. So from that point, choosing our optimal management strategy is not as clear because of the uncertainty we have and the variation in risk tolerance that we documented. So we can recommend that if we are going to pursue translocations, we need to be transparent and clear about the disease risks that those might initiate. And also, in order to do that, we have this, it's clear now that we have a need to understand how tolerant the local managers are, the local public are for taking those kinds of risks. And we need to clarify that tolerance, because some places we have found, even in recent planning efforts, some places the local people and the local biologists are much more willing to take these kinds of risks than others. And then once we can clarify and sort of amalgamate risk tolerance for taking disease-related risks at local and larger scales, we can devise a program to pursue the new population introductions, augmentations, and carnivore reductions in an adaptive management context. So in a context where we're explicit about what we're going to do where and how we're going to monitor what happens, so that we can learn. As we keep doing that into the future of our agency, it becomes easier to make these decisions.
Justin, I just wanted to do a quick time check. We have about 13 minutes left.
Okay, I'm just about done here. Thanks, Imtiaz. So stemming directly from that, we identified two categories of priority research and monitoring needs related to population dynamics and the effect of management actions on population dynamics, and relatedly, the effects of disease risk on population dynamics. So these are the kinds of things that we need to monitor in an adaptive management context once we clarify risk tolerance and get more explicit about incorporating that. And not just disease risk, but clearly some of these populations are small and we've only forecasted out one generation. So some of these populations may be have more risk of extirpation, so being eliminated, over relatively short time horizons than we actually were able to characterize in this process. And that, if that is the case, then willingness to take risks that might initiate a disease event, people might be more willing to take those kinds of risks. Okay. So really quickly, I just want to hit on what has come out of this. So this is not a management plan, but we have presented this to agency leadership and widely within the agencies involved and gotten endorsement. And it has led to project proposals and projects that have been put on the ground. So it is guiding us and intended to guide us in lieu of a management plan, which our previous director of our agency decided, because we have this, we do not need to pursue a formal management plan through a public process. We can use this to guide our efforts. We've done reporting and outreach, through presentations, and also we've got a detailed report and a more reader-friendly summary. This says on our website, but actually our website is being reconstructed, so these links are gone right now, but they will be back up. And then we're in the final stages of our co-author review on a peer-reviewed publication to get this out there. But so the most exciting development that I want to mention is that out of this, there are a lot of parallels to what we discussed and came up with mountain goat management and bighorn sheep management in the state. And as a result of this, we have formed a working group, a bighorn sheep and mountain goat management working group, to essentially construct an adaptive management program. So right now we're at the stage of assembling a 5 to 10 year work plan of what management actions exactly are we going to implement over that time horizon. And then our next step will be, what monitoring are we going to implement? And so that will be the basis of our funding mountain goat and bighorn sheep management over that time horizon to implement an adaptive management process. So while this whole process I described, I mentioned it was more of a proof of concept. We are now getting explicit about bighorn sheep and mountain goat management, getting more explicit about what we're going to do where and what we're going to monitor because of the outcomes and the recommendations we came up with here. So that's all I had. This is my final slide, just maybe something we can leave up during the question and answer period.
Great. Thank you, Justin. That was an extremely clear presentation. You and I could understand. We have a few questions here, and I'll get started. I also want to tell folks that you should be able to unmute yourself anytime and ask a question, or if I'm asking a question on your behalf, feel free to clarify. So the first one is from Tabitha Graves. She's asking which unit did not have documented historic overlap with domestic sheep and goats or goats. And I also wanted to ask if you checked that unit for pathogens and if you found any.
The unit is the West Cabinets, which is in northwest Montana, right on the border of Idaho, Tabitha, and we have not done any disease sampling there. And it's a mountain goat herd. So we don't know. And it's not a place that's easy to work in. In fact, it's a designated roadless area. So I'm not sure if we will be able to conduct pathogen sampling. So the other issue there is that there's imperfect detection. So even if we could sample every mountain goat in that herd, we would not know with certainty whether the pathogens were there or not because the testing protocols are not perfect. So that's another uncertainty that I kind of glossed over.
Great. The other question is from Amanda Summers. What population level do you consider small?
Well, that is a good question. And so I will say that probably for bighorn sheep, we've summarized this, and I think it's 3/4 of our populations are less than 100 animals. And it's got to be similar to that for mountain goats. So some of the populations are very small, like 20, and some of them, like in Glacier Park, there are, Tabitha would know better than I would, but I think it's closer to 2,000. So that's the range we're working with.
My co-host Christy has several questions, so I'll ask her if she can unmute and ask some of those questions.
Sure, thanks, Imtiaz. Really enjoyed the presentation. I was just wondering if you have a sense for what's affecting the sort of the overall health of the herds, especially the difference between those native herds and those introduced herds.
Sure, yeah. That's easier to answer in a historical context than it is like right now. So in a historical context, it seems very clear that two things happened. Harvest was not limited. So in the 1970s, public harvest was easily 10 times what it is right now. And that clearly drove populations down. So it was human harvest that by the early 1970s, a lot of these herds were smaller. And that had a huge effect. And the other thing that had a big effect was our translocation program. I mean, we were taking dozens of animals out of these herds to establish the new herds. Yeah. So historically, that is what led to the decline. That seems very clear, and there's little disagreement about it. However, presently, I mean, all we have is conjecture. I mean, those things are not going on anymore, and some of these herds are not increasing. So predation might be an issue. I mean, there's any number of things that might be an issue. So again, we don't know what is keeping the herd small at this point.
I guess I have a follow-up question, but I don't want to dominate the Q&A. So if someone else has something, please put it in the chat or just unmute yourself. But just wondering about that augmentation piece. If a herd's not doing well in a given area and you add some additional individuals, is there evidence that helps that herd to do better, or is that still pretty uncertain?
It's pretty uncertain. And we have examples both ways, places where we've done that for both mountain goats and bighorn sheep, where the herds are doing a lot better. In fact, there's one bighorn sheep close to where I'm sitting, one bighorn sheep herd close to where I'm sitting, where in the last 10 years, we've actually put bighorn sheep there from 3 different places. And that herd is doing so well that right now we are talking about opening up a hunting season there. But we have other herds like that where we have put maybe 5 or 10 times translocated animals in there, and they are still struggling. So it may have a big effect. It kind of depends on what the limiting factor is. And I mean, just a lot of things that we don't know. So.
Mitch Eaton has a question about the climate model selection. I mean, so we chose multiple GCM, but only one RCP, at least in the models we selected, was highlighted. I'm forgetting, Justin, did we consciously just chose one RCP or 2 RCPs? Usually
we used one, yeah. Okay. So we used the business as usual, RCP 8.5. So assuming that carbon emissions are not going to decrease. And we did that for 2 reasons. One is that the choice of RCP this is what you pointed out, MTS, that it doesn't matter as much for the mid-century projections. They don't vary as much as a century out. So it wasn't that consequential, but we also wanted just to, that's the worst case scenario. And we wanted to maximize the difference between the model that did not have any climate covariance. So maximize the difference between the idea that between the climate change forecast and the idea that maybe climate change will not impact mountain goat habitat.
And so a related question from Tabitha is, was the area of habitat very different across the 3 climate models?
Yeah, it was, I mean, in a relative sense, maybe no, if you're looking at the statewide level, but we're talking about, thousands and thousands of square kilometers. So there is some uncertainty. I'm not saying there's no uncertainty, but under all of our management options, we would have more habitat occupied if we would establish new herds. So there's quite a bit of uncertainty there, but it just wasn't relevant in the alternatives we considered.
Yeah, the mic is available if you want to just unmute yourself and ask a question. I know Christy has a few more. So Christy, would you like to ask your remaining questions?
Sure. Well, one question and this is just my complete ignorance about how goats are managed, but I saw there was something taped over the horns, and I was just curious what that was in that photograph you shared.
Yeah, that's during a translocation. So when we capture the animals and we put them in a confined trailer or something to move them, we tape a plastic sheath over their horn because they will hurt each other with their horns. They fight with their horns. So that's what that's for.
Yeah. And I guess related to that translocation piece, just wondering for some context, historically, would mountain goats have just expanded their range and found new territory as needed, and this very direct intervention is a result of fragmentation? Is that accurate?
Not exactly. Certainly there's fragmentation. So let me back up. So their habitat is naturally fragmented. For the most part, they live in high elevation alpine areas or nearby that. Although we do have some herds in like hot, dry areas. If there are rocky cliffs, much lower elevation areas can support mountain goats. But even those areas are separated by, very low elevation prairie kind of habitat. So they're naturally fragmented. And that isn't to say that the fragmentation that has happened in the valley bottoms wouldn't affect them, though, because they are not great dispersers, usually. And they have very slow life histories, like very low reproductive rates. So natural colonization isn't going to happen very fast. They're going to stick close to where they were born, and not very many of them are going to be born and survive every year. Because just naturally, those are their population dynamics. So the translocations really do speed things up quite a bit.
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks again, Justin, very much for being here today and giving us this excellent presentation. I also want to thank everybody for joining the call today, and I hope to see you next month on our next webinar. So take care, everyone.
Thank you. Okay.